about to run through some steps on casting techniques. It's always a good idea, if you're really serious about fly fishing, to spend a little bit of time with a qualified casting instructor. But having said that, the sort of things they will show you, I'm about to demonstrate. And the other thing I need to mention too is, whenever you're fly casting, always wear a pair of sunnies. I know someone who lost his sight in one eye just simply from the leader hitting him on the iris on his eye. So safety wise, always wear sunnies. And if you get an opportunity and you really want to get into your fly casting, a session with a qualified casting instructor is a really good thing to do. There are two different ways that most people grip a fly rod. This is one, holding it like that, just not too tight, fairly relaxed grip, not really squeezing hard on it. That grip there is a very common one that people use, but the one that I use, I put my thumb on top of the cork grip like that. Again, just very relaxed, don't squeeze too tight. I just find with the thumb on top like that, I get a bit more control over the tip of the rod, and my final presentation cast as well, that little bit of acceleration is much easier, I find anyway, if you've got your thumb on top of the rod like that. You can really control your loop as well, or I find you can, by using your thumb on top, just with that little bit of acceleration at the end as well. I've just mentioned a loop, and for those of you that don't know or understand what a loop is, I've done some drawings here and I will try and explain it and make it as clear as possible, because the loop in the fly line is the base of all fly casting. And for anyone who wants to get into fly fishing, the better you are at fly casting, the more you're going to enjoy the whole experience. So what I've done here, the blue mark here is the rod tip. So you're just making a cast. That green section there is the loop of fly line that is unrolling off the end of the rod tip. So you need to make a loop to make an effective cast, because your fly will follow after that. And to get a decent presentation where a fish is likely to eat it, you have got to be able to cast a good loop and control that loop. What I've drawn on the top here is a tight loop. Now, a tight loop is something that most fly anglers are trying to cast. It isn't air resistant, it cuts into the air because it's got a very tight pointy end on the front end of it. You can cast much more accurately when you're throwing a nice tight loop. So a tight loop is what most fly anglers are trying to achieve and trying to cast. However, there are times when you need to be able to control that loop and open it up a bit more. If you're using a heavy fly like a crab fly or a clouser, for instance, you don't want to be casting a very tight loop because it might crash into the end of your rod tip and break your rod tip. There are other times too, depending on how you want to present your fly, where you will be trying to open that loop up a bit more and not throw a really tight loop. So we've got a tight loop here, and for distance casting, you really need to be able to throw a tight loop, because as soon as that loop starts opening up, you have a lot more air resistance. Down the bottom here, I have got what I've named a useless loop, and it really is. If you open the loop up to that extent, it won't go anywhere. It will just fall in a heap on the water. You won't get a good presentation. You won't get any distance. There are things that cause a big loop like that, but the most common fault people have with casting a big loop is the fact that their rod tip, their casting stroke is in a big arc, and if the rod tip goes in a big arc like that when they cast, the line will follow, and it will come out as a very large open loop. So to cast a nice tight loop or to cast effectively, you need to understand a few things. We will cover all of this in detail as we get into the course, but basically your casting stroke needs to come through in a straight line, so that rod tip is travelling in a straight line to form that tight loop. Then at the very end of it, there's just a little bit of rotation with your wrist, like a little snap, and that will give it a bit more acceleration, and that's the final presentation cast before you drop your rod. And the same thing happens when you do your back cast. You will accelerate from a fairly slow start into a quicker stop with a little bit of rotation there at the end as well. But what you don't want is a big floppy wrist like that, because as soon as you start doing that, you will open that loop right up. The rod tip will travel in a big arc, it won't travel in a straight line, and you won't be able to make an effective cast. So we've got 3 loops there. The loop is formed by the fly line unrolling, and your whole basis for all the casting that we're about to cover revolves around casting and controlling that loop of line. And you will hear people mention it a lot in fly casting circles, and we will certainly be talking about loops a lot and how to control them and how to cast them further into the course.